when Q&A starts, I'll also be walking down and handing mics to people in the audience as well. All right.
I'm not sure how accurate mine. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started here. I'm Thomas Taft. I am the newly appointed Environmental At-Large member for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Excited to be here, excited to have all of you here. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, we encourage you to stay engaged with all the exhibitors and use the social commentary on the, this is a mouthful, Crowd Compass Attendee Hub app. And our event can be found by searching 2020 North Carolina Transportation Summit. In fact, during this session, there's a survey. Unfortunately, we will not be able to post live results, but my friend Harris in the back is going to text me the results of the survey so that we can actually speak to the outcome. We'll also have time near the end to take questions. We'll have two microphones able to pass around the room, so please don't hesitate to ask lots of questions. We want this to be a back and forth, a very interactive session. Beth has an incredible amount of knowledge on this topic, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. All of that out of the way, welcome to the session where we'll discuss barriers that prevent us from reducing our time behind the wheel of a car or vehicle miles traveled. We as a state and nation spend untold billions of dollars every year on our transportation systems, from the maintaining of current systems to the construction of new roads and infrastructure. However, we need to ask ourselves if all of that wealth is being spent effectively. As North Carolina plans for the future, we should take the time to re-examine our policies and pitfalls in place that encourages our transportation system's over-reliance on single-rider vehicles. And to help us understand this issue much more in depth, we have Beth Osborne joining us today. Beth serves as the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit that brings attention to the disconnect between people's desire for more common sense transportation and the policies and, I would say, human nature that prevent that from happening. Beth has a wonderful PowerPoint, and we're going to sit here, and again, we want to make this interactive, so as we get towards the end, please don't hesitate to ask lots of questions. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. So real quick, I do want to let you all know that Transportation for America is part of a larger group that focuses on development policy, both housing policy, land use, and we work with a group of developers as well, because transportation, when it breaks down, it's usually a sign that we messed up the development end of things. We put everything you need too far away from you, the roads got overwhelmed, and we then go try to fix the roads, but it's like trying to fix, you know, the flu or a bacteria with aspirin. We're trying to fix a symptom, not an actual problem. So we're part of a broader group, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to look at the broader issues. Change is, as we heard in the last panel, change is hard. People can be afraid of change, and that's actually served the human species quite well throughout time. It's a natural thing to be afraid of change. And a lot of why folks often feel unable to address the changes we might want to make is because we have a lot of misimpressions about what works and what doesn't. So a lot of my presentation is going to be breaking down those myths with the hope that maybe we feel a little more empowered to take control of the way our communities are built, to give us more money in our pocket, because transportation is the second largest household expense, to save the taxpayer dollars because we are funneling tons of money into a transportation system that's delivering poorer results, that hopefully results in fewer people dying on our roadways, and provides more people with access to the things they need. So a lot of what I'm going to say is a little bit of disappointment in how we run things today, but the idea is to show us that we totally can do better. This is the nation that connected coast to coast with canals, and then with railroads, and then with interstates, and I don't know what happened to the faith in American exceptionalism, but over the last 30 years, we've taken this attitude of, I don't have any control of this, I don't know what to do. We do. We do know what to do, we can do it, we're going to talk about that today.
Absolutely, and I think everyone in this room will obviously has that same feeling, or they wouldn't be here, right? They want to learn about the options that are out there, the impediments to creating a sense of not having to use your personal vehicle at every turn. You know, I mean, there's other options out there, but we have made it through regulation, through zoning, through just a mindset. We have prevented that, and I think we're all interested in seeing how we can begin to slowly turn that tide.
Yeah, my personal story is I grew up in New Orleans, and I went to Louisiana State University, who's going to be the national championship on Monday. And yeah, I heard a clap. I love that person. And I'm hoping the rest of the room's with me, because isn't the enemy of your enemy your friend? Like, you all aren't pro South Carolina, right? So in Baton Rouge, I desperately needed a job to pay my bills while I was in school. But I had a lot of trouble finding a job that I could get to outside of a vehicle. But I was already having trouble paying for my bills, so I couldn't afford to buy a car to get to a job, but I couldn't find a job because I didn't have a car, but I couldn't get a car because I didn't have a job. And that was a real eye-opening experience for me about how exclusive our economy is. I did not grow up poor, and I was having trouble participating because we tell you if you cannot own a vehicle for yourself, we don't want you to participate. We have no interest in your productivity, which is a ridiculous position to take, but that is what underlies the way we build our communities. And my parents were able to buy me a used vehicle that wasn't the greatest vehicle, but it got me where I needed to go, and I loved that thing because I have this strange addiction to eating. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C., I sold it. I didn't buy another car for 11 years until my husband, who works for the FBI, had his headquarters moved out into the exurbs to be close to the CIA, and we had to buy one. But the thing is, I was actually the exact same person through all of those changes. It wasn't me that changed. It was my environment that changed. In Baton Rouge, that car was the most important thing in the world to me because it was my access to everything. In Washington, D.C., it was not. I didn't have one until the FBI made us, which was an $8,000 pay cut per year, as far as I consider it, and I will never forgive them. But I think that's something we always forget. We seem to feel like we are in control of making decisions about how we travel. We are not. The built environment dictates how we behave. And my guess is any of you who have visited a more walkable city find you behave very differently in that environment. And so the good news is we can do that. We've done it in some places, we'll do it in others.
Yeah, I think an interesting opportunity now is just we'll take a quick sort of informal poll and get an idea of how all of you guys get to work. Maybe if you drive to work, maybe we could get a show of hands. I don't know that I necessarily need to ask the next two questions, given the response there. Carpool to work? About bike or walk to work sometimes. So it's great to see, and I would assume that a lot of the folks that answer the question that they bike or walk to work are probably more urban dwellers, and maybe not. Just curious, where are you from? Okay. Wow.
Nice.
Is that downhill or uphill? Understood.
My husband does that trip out to the exurbs. It's not the greatest ride, but there is a bike path that takes him out there, and he can beat the traffic on bike.
It's always disheartening when you're sitting in traffic and the guy on the bike passes by you. But
well, I have a quick follow-up. Of those who drives because work is far from home? Okay. Who drives because if you didn't, you would be run over by something big? Okay. Interesting.
It is indeed. And I think there's also, and to my question about whether it's more of an urban or suburban or even a rural sort of divide in all this, I think to me that's going to be one of the most interesting things to learn from Beth is how you address it in different situations. Obviously it's quite easy to make a commitment to reducing your vehicle miles traveled or completely getting rid of them if you're fortunate enough to live in, let's say, downtown Raleigh and you work for the Department of Transportation, right? Your office is there, your home is there. It's a very different story if you're in Cary and your office is in downtown Raleigh, or if you're in Pittsburgh, right? And even if your job is in Pittsburgh, there's not a lot of easy non-vehicular ways to get around. So it'll be very interesting to hear, and also to hear how we got here.
Sure. Should we just jump in?
I think so.
All right. So a quick how we got here. If you go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the roadway was actually a commercial corridor. I know we think of it as that now. It's not really. But one of the first things that happened when we introduced cars to that corridor was people started getting run over because it was a place where people actually traded goods. They sold goods in the roadway in most places. And we had a huge spike in fatalities, even though we didn't have a lot of drivers. There was a campaign started by the auto industry. They made up a term called jaywalker. Jay at the time was a term for a country bumpkin. And the notion was only a foolish country bumpkin wouldn't know to cross at the appropriate places. So they were calling people stupid, and it was because they were stupid they were getting run over. And that really took off. And so in a desire to keep communities safe, we got the people out of the way. And we started building roadways in a way that really restricted their ability to get across in a lot of places. And as the car really grew, we started designing communities around the car. So all of a sudden, rather than building short blocks that are better for people, that people scale, we started building these super blocks that are, even if you have a sidewalk, they're very unfriendly to walk in. We started developing land use policies that made the things you might get to, you think about walking down a main street where you have a door or a window to look in every couple of steps. That's much more entertaining. And just like any other kind of animal, or well, most animals, we like the feeling of being enclosed and having the building right next to us, not a quarter of a mile over there behind parking. But because the car became the key, we had to introduce parking minimums, and we put the doors between the street and the parking. And so we just started creating this environment that is seen as car-centric, but I think most people who drive today would not consider the getting around to be very pro-car. It's kind of a miserable experience to get around growing cities, and actually even some shrinking cities. So even being car-centric isn't really particularly driver-friendly. It's really not anybody-friendly. So we started out to give people an extra option for getting away or getting around, but what we ended up doing was taking away all the other options of getting around. We didn't add it, we replaced everything else. And that's where we find ourselves today. I take hope from that, because if we were capable of completely destroying every way of getting around except for the automobile, we are certainly capable of reversing it. We can do great things in the broad sense. Some of those great things are not very good. Some of them are quite good. But we've completely transformed all of urban America and most of rural America in favor of making vehicles move quickly. We are absolutely as capable of reversing that.
And all of you that sat in the general session this morning saw the exuberant optimism from our keynote speaker. And I came in this quite optimistic and quite excited to kind of talk about some of the outcomes that he's espousing in that. And while they are quite valid and there are some really exciting opportunities, it's not all rainbows and butterflies, right? We have to actually make some hard choices and make some decisions, both personal decisions as well as regulatory and municipal decisions that are going to be difficult and unpopular, to say the least, at least to begin with.
Yeah, AVs have great promise, but anytime I hear the promise of a new technology come with opposing outcomes. So, for example, the AV is going to allow every single person, young or old, people who can afford a car or not, to drive themselves alone in lots of places, but it's going to reduce congestion. That makes me a little nervous about the promises. I feel like I said earlier today that the AV is a bit of the great Rorschach test of transportation. Tell me what you think AVs will do, and I'll tell you what the most important thing in transportation is to you. But it can't possibly do everything for everybody. And the problem we have is the transportation policy we have in place and the development policy we have in place really forces people to drive alone longer and longer distances. So that's what AV is, just a technology, it's not a policy, is coming into the market to do, is to fill that need that we have pushed on people, we have required. And that's what they are going to do. And I don't know about you all, I'd kind of like to see a show of hands if you agree with me, but if, very nice, agreeing with me before I even talk. If I am late to pick up my kids from school and I can't find a parking space, I'm sending that AV around the block, empty. How many people can think of at least one example of when you're sending the AV on a spiraling mission while you run to do something? Come on, people, be honest. Yeah. That's one thing we have to think about now with AVs, is the zero occupancy vehicle. What is that going to do to emissions? What is that going to do to congestion? I can tell you every city that has substantial ride hailing has significantly worse congestion today. It has encouraged more people to drive alone, and if you open your app and find the closest car is 15 minutes away, you're not waiting for it. So what they need is a bunch of empty vehicles circulating to be available to you. That's their business model. Empty vehicles, always available. So we just have to recognize that and develop a policy construct that pushes the market in the direction we want it to go. Right now, it is in favor of empty vehicles. Doesn't have to be, and there are policies we can put in place to address that.
Absolutely. Now, I believe you do have a slideshow of some sort that we'll want to begin to look at.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit. I'm going to make you all guess at some of these things. It's a bunch of true falses. I actually I'm going to skip over the first one because I don't. Yeah. Okay, so a lot of what we decide in transportation is based on policies or beliefs, some of which are current, some of which may not be. And so we're going to go through a whole bunch of them and see what we think is true. Now, I am using the term here, suburbs, in a very inaccurate way, because there are plenty of highly urbanized suburbs. If you go to Washington, D.C. and you go to Arlington, that is much of a city as any place in America. And there are parts of Washington, D.C. that are just as much of a suburb as any place in America. So I'm using it in a very sloppy way, I fully admit up front. So in terms of if I define suburb as an area with larger houses, yards, driveway, that sort of thing, how many people think that the majority of those in the market prefer that sort of living situation? So I'm going to actually call in the man in the orange shirt back there. Why? Why do you think that's the case? What are they looking for in that environment? Okay. I think that that is exactly right. I think that there is the sense that, especially once people have kids, they just need more space, and that's where people are moving to. The National Association of Realtors does a study of this all the time. They actually, generally on an annual basis, though I think they missed last year, and they have actually found that the majority of the market is looking for smaller lot homes with less space. There's a reason for that, which actually makes sense when you think about it. And if we did market surveys, we'd discover, and that is, just quickly, this is the millennial breakout. And they're more in favor of the more walkable areas than the other generations, but not wildly more. What's interesting is a lot of them want walkable small towns. So they'd love to move to a Dubuque, Iowa, but they still expect it to be walkable. They're just looking, they don't want to be in the big city. We're going to skip that. Okay, this is what is at issue. When I was born in the early 70s, the majority of households had children in them. So the majority of homes we built needed to be able to accommodate a larger number of people in the home. That is not the case anymore. And it's going in the other way. The overwhelming majority of homes these days, and it's only getting bigger, are 1- and 2-person households. But what are we building? We're building more large numbers of bedroom homes. So what is the market implication of something like that? And I have a personal story on that. My parents live in a 4-bedroom home in the suburbs of New Orleans. Through an interesting story that I won't get into here, but maybe over beers we can have this conversation. They actually have 2 different houses within 5 blocks of each other that's 4 bedrooms each. They don't want that much space. None of us live at home anymore. It's kind of great when we all descend on their house at the same time, but they want to move to a smaller home in more of uptown New Orleans where you can get around outside of a car. Their 2 homes are worth less than 1 home half their size in the walkable area. We keep building homes that there's no market for. What that does is it destroys the property value of the people who already own large homes. And we kind of ruin their retirement. At the same time, we drive up the cost of what everyone's trying to get because it just turns out there aren't a lot of 1- and 2-person homes that want 5- and 4-bedroom houses. So one of the things that we believe is that people are desperate to get far outside of town for a large lot home with a lot of bedrooms. And we design a lot of our system, both our land use and our transportation around that concept, which is only, almost 50 years old. Calls out my age. It is dangerous to ride transit. How many people feel it is dangerous to ride transit? Really? Okay, well, you're wrong. It is totally dangerous to ride transit because here's where you'll find the bus stop. Look at this. This is where we're sticking our kids to catch the bus in most places in the United States. And then we say, I don't know why people don't want to take transit. Why don't they want to cross a highway and stand in a mud puddle on the side of a road where cars are passing by and going through puddles and throwing water on you at 55 miles per hour? Well, it's because it stinks. This is what we do, and then we wonder why transit doesn't work. This stinks. Now, this is not really transit's fault. Transit is tagged with this. This is a roadway design fault. This is a DOT's fault. They designed this roadway without transit in mind, and most DOTs have no idea how to design a roadway to support transit movement, nor do they expect anyone in their department to know it, nor do they include it in their design requirements. In fact, where you'll find it in their design requirements are in places like how to get the bus out of the way of the cars. So the worst thing you could do with a bus is block cars behind it. So we move the bus into a bump out area to pick up automobiles, and then it gets trapped there. And then we say no one wants to ride transit because it's not reliable. So most of the things that make transit very unsafe or non-functional are actually because our roadway policy is so hostile towards those who use it and those who operate it. Here's another one. There's an infinite number of these. You can play on Google for hours and find fun ones. Okay, in small and rural towns, driving is the only option. Yeah? Who here grew up in a small town? Something under, we'll describe it as pretty high. Something under like 25,000. That's a lot. So I spent most of my life in New Orleans. Actually, I've now spent most of my life in Washington, D.C. But when I was a kid, I lived in a town called Ravenswood, West Virginia, which at its apex was 5,000. I believe right now it's 1,200. And these are rural small towns. All of these examples, except for the last one, I think, are under really 10,000 people. Rural towns can actually, it's one of the reasons so many millennials would love to live in a small town like this. They don't want to live in a massive city, but they do want that beautiful downtown area where everything you need is in one place. That's Bear. That's Greenville, South Carolina. But what we're trying to imitate in urban areas is actually what rural America invented. They invented towns because you needed a trading post for all of your goods. And in that town, everything was packed into one place around a beautiful little town square. And anyone who's worked on a campaign bounces from town to town to town to town. And they all have the same great features. They have a town square. Some of them have a cute little gazebo. They have a hardware store. They have a restaurant. They have a grocery store. They have maybe a courthouse. They have whatever the seat of government is. It's all right there. That's all we're trying to do in urban areas. It's just our small towns are back to back to back. Okay. High capacity transit only works in the biggest cities, the Washington, D.C.s, the Philadelphias, the San Franciscos. Who thinks? Who thinks big time rail transit's going to work great in like
The Triangle?
Sure, the Triangle, sure. Not the biggest city. Well, some of the greatest transit being built is in quite small communities. Like this is in Provo, Utah, which is about 150,000 people. They looked at their most frequently used bus line. They gave it some dedicated space, off-board fare collection, and its ridership has gone through the roof. I mean, they are getting incredible ridership numbers from people that said they never would ride transit because it's so easy and convenient. And they're looking at expanding. This is Richmond, Virginia. They built a BRT line down what's basically their main street. It has been wildly successful. It has beat all its ridership projections for 20 years within the first 5 years. It has resulted in all kinds of downtown redevelopment. It's been extraordinary. It's really easy to use. As it goes through downtown, it has a dedicated lane. When it gets out into the sides of the downtown, sometimes it shares some space, but it's been very successful. And then the MX bus in Eugene, Oregon, another pretty small community, under 200,000. They have now, I believe, 4 BRT lines that have been very successful, and they're looking at their 5th.
BRT.
Bus Rapid Transit. Very high capacity. It's basically, think of a train on with rubber tires. I mean, it has a dedicated space. It can go very quickly. It doesn't stop every couple of blocks. And they have, like I said, off-board fare collection. So you get your ticket and then you get on board, so you don't have to wait in a queue to pay. They have signal where they're when they approach a signal, they get favored to go through immediately, things like that. It's very efficient. There's an amazing system in Cleveland where if you drive next to it, the bus will keep up with traffic even at free flow almost all the way down the line. So, you know, I just feel like if 100,000 person communities can do this, the Triangle has got to be able to keep up with Provo, right? I feel like you all can. All right, so here's another one. True or false, property values related to walkability?
True.
All right, that was clearly too easy. So this is from the retail perspective. Like I said, we work with a bunch of developers, and they find repeatedly that if you can build retail in walkable areas, the value goes up. It turns out people who walk and bike are better window shoppers. You tend to be a pretty piss poor window shopper when you're driving by at 40 miles per hour. Probably not the safest window shopper. Bicyclists and pedestrians tend to have more money to spend. They tend to be better repeat shoppers. I had a conversation with the CEO of Target. They located one of their first urban facilities in my neighborhood. It was a catalyst to rebuild my neighborhood in D.C., which had been destroyed by the riots in the 60s and didn't really come back until 12 years ago. And he said they were surprised at how much more profitable the walkable area Target was, as opposed to suburban Targets where people show up a few times a year and fill up their trunks. In a walkable area, they drop by every single day. You know, they were there all the time, and they bought less each time, but they spent way more over the year. And so it's just much more profitable for retail. But we make walkability very hard. Our priority is to move vehicles through quickly. There is not one business that wants the vehicle to pass them by. They want people to stop. And then this is what Redfin puts out about walkability and home values. A difference of just 1 point can make a difference of thousands of dollars per square foot in value. However, it's when you get over 70% that each additional walkability point makes a huge difference.
That's just real quick a question. My day job is in real estate development.
I was actually going to ask you to tell me to talk about how easy it is to build in an already developed area, or how hard it is.
Well, it's quite difficult, but it's always worth it again because your valuations are always going to be significantly higher. One of the really frustrating things about what we do, for example, we've recently executed on a student housing project that is literally campus edge, right? You walk across a 4-lane road that's signalized intersection, 610 beds. We had to build 585 parking spaces for it, right? Where is that disconnect happening that everybody wants to talk walk score, everybody wants to talk walkability, yet everybody has to have a place for their car, a 2-car garage, right, or a parking deck, and then therefore driving up the cost of that housing for everybody else. As we saw this morning, there's 80% of I'm going to skew the statistic, but the surface parking takes up some huge amount of space in cities across the country, and it's really frustrating, for lack of a better word.
In the average city, there are 6 dedicated parking spaces for every car. That's an extraordinary. I mean, it sends a signal that you think your land is worthless. Yeah. And if you just look on Google Maps, you'll see how much space is dedicated to the car. It's why you see these very tall buildings surrounded by a moat of parking, and that automatically kills walkability. That's just not human scale. No one likes weaving through parked cars and people trying to find parking. But we see this all over the place, and it's because buried in most everybody's zoning code, unless they've actively sought to change it, is something called a parking minimum. It's written into law. You must build a certain number of parking spots for every building you build. And some of them, well, in fact, almost all of them are preposterous. I was saying earlier that there's a developer we work with in Sacramento that was looking to build housing for homeless vets. And it was all efficiencies in 1-bedroom apartments. And they were required to build 2 parking spaces per unit. Because if there's one thing a homeless vet has is 2 cars. And it's the notion again that the number one thing we have to do is accommodate as many cars as possible. And as soon as you make that decision, you actually, and free parking no less, you drive up the cost of housing because you're housing vehicles for free instead of people. It always results in the urban areas in escalating property values. It makes development harder. It makes redevelopment almost impossible. There are many examples of developers trying to come in and redevelop empty space in cities, and they can't do it because of the amount of parking they're going to have to build. And so we have to recognize that buried in almost everything we do is a sense that the number one goal is to make cars move quickly and make it cheap to store it wherever you go at any time of day. So a lot of the parking lot sizes are designed to accommodate the right number of vehicles on Black Friday, the one day everyone's shopping. And so if it's empty the entire rest of the year, that's considered a great result. Now, if you're an economist, you want things to be efficiently utilized. But in transportation, it's the exact opposite is the goal. A completely empty roadway is the goal. That means you don't have to slow down. So, and I will also say there is a sense, it comes from people too. They will say, every place I go, because we work on parking minimums, and we actually helped a couple of people recently change their rules on parking minimums, including in a city like Honolulu, which has some of the worst congestion in the entire country. And the first thing you hear is there's no parking in my area. And if you go and do a parking study, what they mean is I can't park right in front of the door I want to enter, and that equals no parking. We kind of have to break.
If you have a solution for that, I'd like to talk to you after this, please.
We could definitely talk, and we have worked with a bunch of places to get rid of it, but it has huge traffic impacts, it has huge public cost impacts, and it absolutely destroys walkability. So I have just a couple more. Okay, so today in 2020, latest stats are really for 2018 right now, but there are fewer fatalities on our roadways. True or false? True? It's a trick question. It is true than in the past. And the answer is it is true. There are fewer fatalities. We've had a very steady downward trend in fatalities, but there's an increase in fatalities for people outside of vehicle. So where that comes from, DOTs love to take credit for this, but it has to do with vehicle standards that have been put in place in recent years that make roof crush less likely, that reinforce the windshield so that you can't be ejected from your car, that prevent you from backing up over someone. There are all kinds of requirements we put on vehicles. So even if you get hit at a high speed, you're likely to survive it. But a lot of that does nothing for someone outside of their vehicle. And in fact, in this country, this is not true in other places, we allow a design of sports utility vehicles that make it impossible for the driver to see the pedestrian and turns them into unwitting killers. I've spoken to police about this, and they've gotten into SUVs that have run over people and killed them, and they've said it was absolutely impossible for the driver to see that person. Why would we permit something to be designed in a way that a safe driver cannot stop from hurting a person? So there's a lot that we could do even on the vehicle standard side of thing, just in terms of the slope of the front of the vehicle. But a lot of it is because our idea of making roadways safe is making sure that someone driving at a high speed is safe. But if you're going at a high speed and you hit a person, they're going to die. And there's great statistics on this that just show that at 20 miles per hour, if a vehicle hits a person, they're 80 or 90% likely to live. And if it goes up 15 miles per hour or 20 miles per hour, that reverses. So, okay, this is my last group of questions. It has to congestion. Congestion increases in proportion with population growth. Okay, who thinks true? Raise your hands. Okay, who thinks false? All right, a lot of people sitting on the sidelines, I see. All right, I'm going to use Cuyahoga County, Ohio, as an example of the point I'm going to make. This is Cuyahoga County in 1948. This is Cuyahoga County. This is the Cleveland area in 2002. Same number of people in both cases. They've had no change. They've actually had a slight drop-off in population, but it's minor, so I wouldn't really call it a huge drop-off. The result of this has been they've had to almost double their freeway and arterial miles. Same number of people have to pay for that. That's not cheap. And they have more than doubled their hours of rush hour, and they have doubled their congestion with the same number of people. And this is what we find all over the country. We have somehow pioneered a way in this country to move the same number of people half as quickly for twice the cost. It's really quite impressive. And we're about to come out with a report that looks at the top 100 cities in the country. And there is no country, there's no city that has not seen congestion go up, including those that are losing population and have increased their roadway capacity by a large amount. So this notion that we're just going to build 2 more lanes, I swear to God, this time it's going to do it. It's not true. It never works, especially when you're allowing development to happen like this. And this is how we do development now. If you take the same number of people, you spread them over twice the territory, you are going, that's how you generate congestion. If you got the 100 smartest engineers in this room and said, is there a more efficient, quicker way to create congestion than to spread people out? They would say no. So this is the problem. And then, so this is a this is a slide from the Director of Transportation from Orlando. It's not actually in Orlando, it's in southern Florida. But these 2 houses here at the bottom are 70 feet apart. And if you want to drive between them, it's 7.1 miles. And we don't know where the traffic comes from. If going 70 feet takes 7 miles, that's where the traffic comes from. And there's no amount of extra capacity you can add to those roadways that's going to fix that. All right, so this is the last one I'm going to do. High congestion is a sign of a strong economy. Yes, true? Raise your hand. True? False. It is absolutely true. If you go down a corridor with low congestion, you tend to see lower economic activity. Now, we justify congestion relief based on economics because if you save 30 seconds, you're going to use those 30 seconds to create something fabulous, right? And that's great for the economy. I know that statement sounds preposterous, but that is what underlies almost all transportation economics. We justify projects. They're going to save people 90 seconds. We multiply that by the number of cars on the road, and we call that an economic good. No one's going to use 90 seconds to do anything good for the economy. They might leave their house 90 seconds later. Probably not. But this is an example of a clear road and a crowded road. If you're the mayor of these 2 communities, which one do you want to be the mayor of? The one on the right, obviously. What's wild is, oh, my pictures didn't come. Oh, no, they did. Okay. So a traffic engineer views this wide open road. They actually give it a letter grade A through F. They view the wide open road as an A and the crowded road as an F. Every economist would reverse it. So this is something we also need to get our arms around. In a strong economy, you're going to have a lot of people going to the same place. And if you try to bypass a healthy corridor, you're going to destroy the corridor. You want people to arrive at some point. But in transportation, there's this very strange concept that the goal is to keep the vehicles moving. We don't measure or, frankly, care if you arrive. If you go in circles at speed, that is an A+. If you travel and stop and go congestion for 10 minutes, that is a failure that requires a $100 million investment tomorrow. And this is what underlies a ton of our transportation policy. It's not connected to the experience of the driver. Clearly, we'd all rather a 10-minute stop and go trip than going in circles or going on a free flow for 60 minutes. Most people want to get where they're going quickly. In the 1950s, we didn't know how to measure origin and destination. So we measured little increments of roadway. But what we did to make those little increments of roadway move faster actually cut off other short trips and forced more people into their cars. And we just didn't bother to measure it because that's not what we were going after. So a lot of what pushes us away from creating walkable communities and healthy corridors and communities where transit works and communities where your trip is just shorter in or out of a car is because our belief is the goal is for the car to move quickly. That underscores everything we do, and it shoves development out. It makes getting out of your car dangerous, and it results in corridors that are empty as a success story. So those are my various myths.
Well, so where is the disconnect between, I mean, again, I think we asked a question earlier about how enjoyable are people's commutes, right? How enjoyable is your time in the car? Now, for me, it's fairly enjoyable. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. So when I'm in my car, I usually don't have them, which is just relaxing. Yes, thank you. But I mean, for the general population, you know, there seems to be a disconnect between sort of the idea that, look, we don't really love being in our cars. We don't really love the searching for parking spaces. You know, where is that disconnect? And I know that is, the $60,000 question, obviously.
Well, I don't know if it is. I mean, right now, where there's an opportunity to get out of your car, almost every single human being in this country takes it. I mean, there's this notion that people don't want to get out of their car, but they're they're running up the value of the areas where you can. The only people that don't seem to understand that people want to get out of the car are the people constructing the environments in which they're forced to move. It's a fascinating disconnect between the leaders and the people. In my neighborhood, people have bidding wars for houses that need to be completely rebuilt. It is a preposterous circumstance that now makes my neighborhood completely unaffordable to me. It would be great if there were more neighborhoods like mine. But because of the land use rules that most locals refuse to change, in DC, that's no longer a problem. We can't keep up with the demand anymore. But in most places, building my neighborhood is against the law. And so it's kind of like the diamond trade. You've got this incredibly, a common substance that someone wants to make money off of, so they restrict the supply and it drives up the cost. We all learned about this in macroeconomics in college. It's pretty simple. Where supply is constrained and demand is high, the price goes up. Well, if government, which is the entity doing this, cuts off your supply to what the market wants, property values go up, and they go up to a level where only the most wealthy and the people with most means can afford to get it. And the only way you fix that is you build a ton more of what people want.
Excellent. And I'm sorry if I didn't make it seem like an action item earlier. If you do go to the app and take a look at the poll questions, it would give us an opportunity to gauge that. And Harris in the back, I lied. I said you could text me. I actually don't have my phone, so if you want to bring me the results, I didn't want the distraction while I sat up here. Otherwise, I'd be checking emails because that's what we do. Okay. I think what we'd really like to do is just kind of welcome a lot of questions now. I think Beth is someone who is used to fielding fairly hardball questions, for lack of a better word. And
I don't always have the answer, unfortunately.
Fair enough.
Bring them on.
But we would love to hear from you guys, and I see a hand up here in the sort of back left. I think he's cutting it on.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a couple of quick questions, and then I'll sit down and let you answer. The first one was, one of the congestion issues that I've seen is increased truck traffic, which I don't think anybody has a good answer for right now. So I would enjoy your comments, because that, I'm sure, complements even the Cuyahoga, where in Ohio. So, and the other one was the bus issue. And I've traveled around and worked in 28 states, and I've seen bus programs come and go. And they come and go because they have government funding for a short window of time, and they offer low fares, and they're never economically feasible. And then when the funding runs out, they go away. And I would be interested to see if I'm wrong, but that's what I've witnessed.
So those are really great points. And actually, yesterday I was on a Sirius XM radio talk show for truckers, which is really fun. And we got phone calls in from truckers. And I will say this about the truckers. Whereas we and I think of we because I used to work at USDOT, and I work a lot with transportation agencies. We in the kind of public transportation community, and I mean government transportation providers, we always think of what is the capital improvement we can make? What can I build to fix the problem? Not one trucker really called with a building solution. It was all operations. They were constantly thinking about how we could use the existing space more efficiently. We don't have that skill, really, at DOTs. There are some. It's a way minor portion of the program, and it's generally viewed as less prestigious within the community, which is unfortunate. But we have a pretty sophisticated and extensive highway system. And, bringing in kind of the industrial engineering perspective and saying, how can I make what I already have built work better, is really what we should be doing top to bottom across the country. And I just was fascinated at how the truckers went straight to that. You do raise a great question of the truck traffic going up. I mean, I know I've displaced a lot of my trips with having stuff delivered to me. I have my groceries delivered to me. I have a lot of packages because of Prime delivered to me. What's interesting is we're still thinking of trucking within the transportation agency perspective as long-haul trucking. And that's not really what's increased as much as the delivery. Amazon's taken over the world, and they're building distribution facilities close to every single metropolitan area. And it's about getting to your house from that facility, not about going 350 miles. That's where it breaks down. And I was here talking to one person who works at one of the delivery companies. And he was saying that he was talking with a state DOT from the South, I won't identify who they are, and it's not North Carolina, about a big congestion bottleneck in a particular area of one of the major cities. And the DOT was saying, well, we're thinking about building a bypass to get around that. And the delivery person had to say, I can't bypass my delivery point. But again, the DOT thought is, I got to get the traffic moving. The point is not the origin of the destination, it's the flow within. And we have to get out of that thinking. I will say one of the best things we can do for the truckers who really, we need them on the road, is those of us that are, on the road by kind of being forced there even for short trips, we can make it possible for us to take short trips off of the interstates. It's ridiculous that we use the interstates as main streets. They aren't. They should be on parallel local routes, and that should be of great value to the interstate, is to have those riders off and out of the way. And those of us that don't want to be in the way of those trucks, make it not deadly for me to get out of the way. Right now we build our roads so that there's a ton of traffic on that road that doesn't have to be there. In terms of your second question on transit, you are 100% right. It's very easy in transportation generally to get capital support. And this isn't just true for transportation. This is true for all infrastructure, for water infrastructure, for everything. There's a lot of money to build it, and then it's on the locals to operate it. And operations is the big cost. And what happens is they tend to not be able to keep up with the operations and maintenance costs, but they can come back to the state or the federal government to rebuild it. So that's what they do. It's like a parent who tells a teenager, I will not help you maintain your vehicle, but every time it breaks down, I'll buy you a brand new one. Well, you're going to be buying a whole lot of brand new vehicles. That's what our infrastructure policy is. And I think if the feds and the state had to be more in the operations business, they would be more careful about what's being built where and how spread out things are getting. But the deal is, when it comes to moving people, no business ever made a dime off of moving human beings. Moving things, it works because you can stack them on top of each other. You don't always have to air condition. You don't have to feed them. They don't have to go to the bathroom. Very simple. People are a pain. They're very expensive. On transit, we actually make transit pay its whole way. On our roadways, we don't. I mean, we're losing money on our roadways. That's why we have backlog. No movement of people ever makes money. On the transit side, we're not willing to cover the gap. On the highway side, we sort of cover the gap, but really what we do is just let the roadways deteriorate, and that's how we don't cover it. So it's a bigger, deeper issue where no one wants to pay the operations and maintenance costs of transportation. It's just not very glamorous.
Some other questions? First hand I saw was, again, far left in the rear. Sorry, Harris.
You're going to get your steps today.
Keep going.
In
burgundy.
The burgundy jacket, yeah. My favorite color, by the way.
Thanks. So there's such a strong car culture in the United States. So I think about my brother-in-law as a gearhead. There's people who like sports cars. Not to mention, if you watch any movie at all or turn on the TV, you're seeing dangerous behavior depicted. So I wanted to know your recommendations for changing the culture, which in some cases has to come before people are willing to get out of their cars.
So again, I don't know that I agree with you that there's a huge cultural barrier. There are certainly people that love cars. My father-in-law bought a scrap car and rebuilt the sucker. He loved it. It stunk to drive or ride in, but he was super proud of it. And there are people like that. That is not the overwhelming majority of people. People drive because that's how they eat. And they're not addicted to their car, they're addicted to food. That's an understandable addiction. If we had to change people's minds, you would not see walkable communities become so unaffordable, but for the richest people in America. The market's way past our policies by decades and leaps and bounds. It's really time for elected representatives and DOTs to catch up to it. DOTs have a lot of policies buried in their agencies that are truly unsafe for everybody. And it's required design policy. The only thing they measure when they design a roadway, other than things like the strength of the pavement and the materials they're using, is something called level of service, which is this A for F through F measure. And an A is a wide open road. That's it. They don't measure. They don't make a projection about how many crashes there's going to be, and then measure it, and then make sure that it was accurate. What they do is they build it. They watch to see who crashes and dies, and then when there's a hot spot, when there's enough people that did it in one place, they come back to fix it. Our other priorities are not in the design process at DOTs. There are a handful that are trying to fix it, but most of them will not grapple with the requirements that they put on their engineers. I know right here in North Carolina, if an engineer wants to build a more complete street like you see on the left, they have to go through a design exception process that can take them 18 to 24 months. And then when they're reviewed and the price of that project goes through the roof because of the delays and they're not on time and on budget, they are rated as a poor engineer. That is a problem. There are real substantive issues within DOTs that we have to deal with. It's not people. They're paying a fortune to live in that neighborhood.
Just like to add that, we've seen the results of sort of this much heralded millennial generation and an antipathy for cars and a desire to be walkable. So I would implore the planners out there to take advantage of this wave of folks who are interested in more walkable, safer, more walkable communities. And just think about that as we're coming up with zoning and design standards that don't prevent that from becoming the new way of doing things, right? This is an opportunity more than anything.
I would add boomers. A lot of them are downsizing, and I know my mom does not like driving at night anymore. She's fine during the day, but her night vision's just not very good. She'd love to get out of her car. She can't afford to unload her 4-bedroom home and move into a smaller home. They're not built. They don't exist in a lot of places. Their demand is high. She can't afford it. That's land use policy that the city of New Orleans has enforced on her. And even developers that would like to build more of it run into a lot of trouble because, again, that parking minimum comes up, makes it hard to build multifamily homes, smaller lot homes. So we have a lot to unwind, but it really is government in the way of the market, and we need to figure out ways to get government out of the way.
Absolutely.
So, you're true that the trend is changing with millennials, but that's just in comparison to generations previous. It's still the minority percentage of millennials that are not driving, that are wanting smaller homes or more dense places. Your numbers showed that 1 in 5 millennials wants that. What is your plan for 4 and 5? And then as far as large homes and large lots, it's not really a matter of preference, it's a matter of price, because we can't afford what other people could. And they also lost a lot of value in their homes, so the value they want to sell their homes for is not as much as they can get now, because we still haven't recovered from the recession. So, I'm a bicycle pedestrian coordinator. I want all the things you're saying, but you're denying a lot of things that are true about the car culture. America is still very much a car culture.
Right.
They love their cars.
So do I.
And I have elderly aunts too. And she will, that's another problem that we have is the elderly will not give up their licenses. They keep them way after it is safe to drive. Like, that is their biggest fear.
Well, what else would they do? How would they get groceries?
Lyft, delivery, Amazon. You can go car-free and convenient. Baby boomers have a lot of money to, buy those services. And remodeling is at an all-time high and increasing, so they could stay and live in their giant homes.
A lot of people can't afford to live their life using Lyft. And Lyft is not available in a lot of suburban areas.
They couldn't afford cars if they couldn't afford Lyft.
I don't know that that's true, especially now that you can run a car into the ground for, and I was just hearing about someone who had a car that got 500,000 miles. My car's paid off, and I'm going to keep it at least for another 10 years with no cost at all. Look, you may have missed it, but the millennial preference, according to the National Association of Realtors, is 12% for that suburban large lot home. 12.
Yeah, and I just told you that's because they can't afford it. It's a pricing issue more than a size preference.
Oh, no, you're right,
and it's not even about suburban, it's about size and price. It's not about location. And then also, that's for
it's the
single
larger lot homes that
and
are
not every
cheaper.
millennial plans on staying single and without children.
Right, but even with millennials getting married and having kids, the majority of homes will be 1 and 2 person homes.
Right.
Right. So 1 and 2 person homes don't need 5 bedrooms.
Well, no, they don't. But there's people that own them and buy them.
Yeah.
I mean,
no,
yeah,
well,
no
actually,
one
no.
needs 3 cars either.
That's not the case. Here, let's back up.
I can find you articles that contradict what you say.
Well, and
I mean, I just think that you deny a lot of things in your analysis.
so I think you're confusing the difference between no choice and desire and love. Like, I loved my vehicle too, but look at the surplus of the conventional home.
I mean, that is one graph. I can send you other articles that show that there is no problem. In the Sun Belt, yes, there's a problem selling large, expensive homes that sold for inflated prices that people still owe debt on, and they can't unload them for the prices they want.
I don't know how to argue with the statistics of the National Association of Realtors wrong. So or that the supply of homes and I don't know how to argue with that.
I think it's worth mentioning that exactly what we're hearing here is that there is a disconnect, right? I mean, I think there's a reason that we all know what a walk score is, right? Well, there's a reason that that's something that's become an important metric by which housing or a business is measured. But then, how do we get to that point of saying, okay, not only is that an important metric, but let's act upon that, and let's actually show folks that they can live without a car, they can live in a place that they can use delivery, they can use others. So I like the back and forth.
I think she makes a very good point that it doesn't matter what you want to do. In most places, you cannot do it. So people aren't going to give up their cars. If I still lived in Baton Rouge, you can be damn sure I would be driving everywhere because I did not have another choice. How many cities in America do I have the choice in? So if it's not a choice, you're right. People can't take a choice that does not exist, and they won't.
Right here?
We have the 60% growth rate, but it is being driven by 3 and 4 and plus person families.
Like a bedroom community sort of thing?
It's a bedroom community, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what we keep trying desperately to get out of. Because everyone wants, the ones that are coming to us do want the home with the lot and the yard and the dog.
And
but
they probably
want
want
to
the
work
small
in
town
Charlotte.
feel, right?
They want the small town feel, but they want to work in Charlotte, or at least they have to work in Charlotte for the time being. And so we're trapped in that cycle of we want walkability, we want but the purchaser coming in wants the big lot, so everything is spread further out, so the congestion gets worse, and everyone's on the same 2-lane road headed north towards Charlotte every day, and then yelling at us on the town council going, why can't we move down the road any faster than this? So how do I make your analysis relevant to my small town?
That is a great question. I have a question for you. If I wanted to move into your small town and I didn't want a large lot home, what were my options?
There are smaller homes, older homes in the area, and we just, the past 2 years, put in our first apartments.
Okay, so you're starting to make it accessible to people that might want something different.
We're trying,
Okay.
but we had a study of millennials done that came back and said we had a statistically insignificant number of millennials to study. So
I guess
what we're getting in our apartments is more the older people who don't
That's
want
what I
the
was gonna
bigger
guess.
home. And we're
Yeah.
building senior, 55 and up communities with the smaller homes for the grandparents that are moving here. They want to be close to the grandkids, and
Yeah.
the grandkids are in our community, so they're building smaller homes for them, 55 and up. But it's not millennials; it's
Right.
the older generations in those homes.
Well, and some of it is, who do you study? Do you study the people that are there and currently trying to get there?
Mhm.
Well, you're not going to have a lot of people looking for multifamily developments if you have no multifamily development. So it's like we do this in transit too. We do transit surveys of the current user. Those are the people on your typical transit system who have no choice but to be on it. And you're asking them. What you should ask is the people who have a choice and have used that choice to not come anywhere near that transit system, what the transit system should be. If you do a market survey of those who have no choice but to buy the stuff you have on the ground now, you are going to have a skewed population. You all are stuck in a spot that you're not quite sure you're ready for the change, it sounds like. And nobody does. Nobody wants to see their community character change. But I got to tell you, where there's regions that are growing, You have to decide how you're going to manage it, not try to resist it, because you will lose. The other thing is you have to ask a question of how much is it your responsibility to give people a great trip when they have decided that they are willing to live far from everything they need because they want the quiet, they want the large lot. I mean, what if we switched that and said, I purchased a small house because I wanted to be close to everything I need, and now I'm bummed out that I don't have an extra bedroom. Should the taxpayer build me an extra bedroom? But this is our policy. You move far away from everything you need because you really want the extra space, and then you're bummed out that the trip sucks. And it's the taxpayer's responsibility to fix it. Maybe it's not.
Thank you. Gentleman back here left.
Planning Commissioner and Council member, I wanted to offer an observation and then ask the legitimate question of you. The observation being, if only the people who support denser walkable communities would show up to rezoning hearings and testify.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. My question for you, though, is picking up on two things you said during this presentation, the preference for walkability, but also the very astute comment about people evaluate the availability of parking based on how convenient it is for them. Do you have any survey data that force those kind of stated preferences to become more revealed, where you ask people, which do you prefer, walkability or a convenient place for your car?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because we get both in isolation. Of course everybody wants a walkable community. Of course everybody wants a convenient place for the car.
And
but you can't always have both. Which do you want? Do you have any survey data like that?
I don't know. I wonder if one of my colleagues does. I have a colleague that runs the Form-Based Codes Initiative. She might. If you could come by at the end and give me your card, I'll ask her and see what I can get to you. I also wanted to mention I heard a really interesting interview on a podcast called The Weeds last week that was with someone talking about the way we do public hearings over developments. And one of the things they were talking about is all developments have localized impacts but generalized benefits. But all of our hearings focused on those who are taking the localized impacts. And of course, people across the city aren't going to come to talk about the generalized benefits they're looking for. Maybe we've set up the system wrong, and maybe there's a different way to go about it. It was one of the most interesting discussions I heard, with some very interesting ideas about ways to change that. So. Right here in the middle.
Yeah, I have a question. I live in Charlotte, and there's every day or two there is a news stream that says something like affordable housing is no longer available. Yeah. People have been pushed out of their homes because of the gentrification of the areas. They're unaffordable. They've torn down homes that were affordable. They tore down my home I was in 25 years, and now they won't let me go back in because it's 3 times the cost. Yep. What is being done in the way of mitigation of any of this, and is it something that can be done?
Boy, we just had a breakout discussion within my office about this issue and how poor a job we've done nationwide of grappling with it. My neighborhood's a perfect example of it. Initially, the new development was in empty spaces that had been empty for decades, so it was additive. But then with all of those amenities coming in, all the property values increased, and that put huge pressure on renters. Owners did beautifully. So the woman who lived 2 doors down from me, who bought her house with her husband in 1952 for $10,000 cash, she was super excited that after going through riots and all kinds of crime and just decades of downtimes, she and her family were finally going to get to benefit and sell their house. The renters do not have that capacity to benefit from what's happening. And the rents have gone sky high. And the other thing is, while those who still own their home after decades can stay, and we have all kinds of policies in place to protect them, if you want to come in, forget it. I can't come in. So yeah, this is a huge issue, and I think it comes down to the fact that we've never done affordable housing well, ever. we really stink at it. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it that we could spend hours and hours talking about. Some of it is going back. I'm sure that the gentleman from the Planning Commission can tell you about how popular it is to come in and talk about affordable housing in a neighborhood. My husband grew up in a ski town in Idaho called Sun Valley, and they consider undesirable affordable housing to be $300,000 condos, and they don't want them anywhere near them. I mean, it just doesn't matter where you are or what's considered affordable. No one wants that near them, and we need to grapple with that as well. The other thing is we have to grapple with it up front. One place where DC really fell down, and I think this is true in a whole bunch of areas of the country, is they didn't really expect what they were doing to work really well. And so by the time it's starting to roll in the right direction, it's too late. You can't get ahead of it at that point. And it seems silly to lock in affordable housing when all you have in an area is affordable housing. When I moved to DC in the mid-90s, my neighborhood, there was no home worth $100,000 in my neighborhood, not one. And when it turned in 5 years. So somehow we have to convince cities to get ahead of it when property is still cheap and really preserve it. We have to have better policies to preserve affordable housing. And we're going to have to grapple with the idea that it's not just low-income housing. There's that middle housing that also has to be affordable. There's something that the lady over here said about people retiring wanting to move close to their grandkids, and it reminds me of something a gentleman by the name of Robert Grow, who worked in Salt Lake City when they were first planning for the Olympics, and they were looking at the way the region should grow and how to support new rail transit in the area. And the biggest thing that they wanted was for people in the same family to be able to live in the same neighborhood, which makes sense. Grandparents want to live close to their kids who just came out of college, their kids that have grandkids in the house, but our zoning rules prohibit that. Multifamily housing will be over there. Small single-family housing will be here. Large single-family housing will be over there. So families may not be close to each other. And we have to kind of break that down and mix it up, and that's just hard. No neighborhood gets excited about it. Yeah. So the question was, can I speak to other DOTs or local transportation agencies that are using the concept of access to jobs as their main measure of determining, where investment should go and how to build transportation? This is a really new, exciting way that technology can change the way we approach transportation. So, like I said earlier, a lot of the way we measure transportation now is because the program grew up in the 1950s, and measuring where people came from and where they went to was really hard. It was super expensive surveying, and if you were going to measure every trip from every household that people would possibly take, it would be exorbitantly expensive, take tons of people, and take tons of time to do. So we looked for proxies, and what's still in place today are all the proxies we came up within the 1950s. But technology has made new interesting things available to us, and in our smartphones, we have, if you pull up Google Maps, you know where all the roads are, you know where all the transit is, and you know where all the things are. And with cloud computing, you don't have to have a supercomputer to measure every potential trip from every single house. You can actually run millions of potential trips across your region in an hour or two. So it's an exciting new thing that a bunch of DOTs are doing now to bring that into their design of projects and their decision making. So the state that has done the most is Virginia. They put some serious money into this to develop a tool to help you measure access to jobs and access to non-work facilities, to services. So groceries, banks, schools, daycare, healthcare, all the retail, those sorts of things. Interestingly, while everyone loves the access to jobs measure, that is only 20% of trips and 30% of VMT. It is disproportionately the trip taken by men, but it's still even it's a very small number of even men's trips. It's the sexy trip from the engineering perspective, because that's when everyone's doing the same thing at the same time, and so that's when all the congestion shows up. But it's access to services that determines how much you spend on transportation, how many miles you drive as a household, how many cars you own. It's more related to greenhouse gas emissions. The more access you have, the lower the greenhouse gas emissions, public health outcomes. All the really cool quality of life stuff is associated with access to services. So Virginia uses this to score new capacity projects. And they will determine whether or not to fund a project based on how it moves the needle in terms of access to jobs and access to services by all modes of transportation. And my organization's helped them put this together, and we've also helped them to put together ways to measure bike ped trips, which we don't have great ways to measure, because even if you have on a map that there's a bike lane, if it's a 3-foot bike lane with a strip of paint and you're next to 55-mile-per-hour traffic, we pretend that thing doesn't even exist. That's not a bike lane. That's a place I would recommend you not bike anywhere near. But speed of the traffic's a big one, and there's a couple others that I could talk about to people that care about the details. So Virginia pioneered it. It's now being used. We're working with Massachusetts DOT. Utah DOT is trying to incorporate it into their program. They've got legislation requiring them to do so. The state of Hawaii has done it. We've been working with the state of Washington. They're doing it more in corridor studies right now, and we're also hopefully going to pilot it with the state of Minnesota. And there's money in the Environment and Public Works bill from the Senate on transportation reauthorization to provide money for DOTs to go try this out. So it's something that's gathering a lot of momentum, but it's a standard that speaks to the actual user of the system, because you don't actually tend to care that this increment of this trip was good. You care about how long it took for you to get from here to here. And so this actually measures that. And I think it's going to be an exciting way to encourage DOTs to talk in a way that makes sense to the people who are funding them, and help people engage better in the conversation about how transportation works.
Just so I'm clear, this is a way of bringing analytics to bear outside of just the commute. Is that fair to say?
It's both. So right now, the way we measure, quote, commutes is we look at 2 observed locations along corridors, and we see how the traffic is going in there. We don't actually ask whether or not a person's trip is faster. We ask whether or not this observed section is faster. And a lot of what we do to make this observed section move faster cuts off shorter trips and pushes more development out and lengthens trips. From the perspective of the person driving, we tend to talk about our trip in terms of time, but engineers talk about it in terms of speed. And obviously speed plays into time, but talking directly to the taxpayer, we should be thinking in the terms that they think, which is the time that they spend on the trip. And when the trips are shorter, either because you've increased speed and reduced congestion, or you provided more frequent transit, or you've straightened out the transit route and made it run faster, or you've made something walkable that there used to be an obstruction that made it impossible, or maybe you've bridged over an obstruction like a rail bed. Any of those things can make the trip shorter. And what's beautiful is it puts all of those potential solutions on the same playing field, rather than having to figure out what the benefit is of a bike lane versus a roadway expansion. Or you can look at a land use solution instead. And this is something the city of Madison did in Wisconsin. They looked at a new development on the fringe, and they were looking at expanding the roadway that connected them into town. And they realized that if they put some tax dollars to incentivize development closer, retail and groceries and things like that closer to the development, they didn't need to do the expansion, and it cost way less to do that.
Thanks for being here. I'm interested in your thoughts on the difference between, or the relationship between transportation demand management versus supply, specifically as we're looking at alternative modes, right? Non-single occupancy vehicle commutes. And in the context of what's been going on here in the Southeast relative to everyone wants light rail, commuter rail. I mean, when you looked at what happened in Nashville, the transit referendum failed miserably. And the argument there and the lesson learned in Nashville was we didn't do a good enough job communicating what alternative modes already exist. When you look at what's happening or soon to happen in Charlotte with the regional transit plan, are we doing a good job right now increasing ridership for existing transit, increasing the communication of availability of alternative modes that are currently there, So a new user might say, wow, I didn't realize this was available to me. And when eventually we get a referendum, of course I want more of this. And when you looked at what happened in the Triangle, we didn't even get that far to a vote.
Yeah.
But at the same time, understanding that planning, design, and hopefully ultimate construction of light rail is a very long-range effort, how do you balance those two competing factors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that we fail to understand how intimidating it is to try a new mode of travel. You know, so I either walk or take transit almost every day of my life. But when I go to a new city, I'm nervous about trying their transit. They're impenetrable. Just try to find out what the dang fare is at a bus stop. It's impossible. Try to the maps that they put. If there's a map at the bus stop at all, which is chances are there isn't. I don't know what mapper they engage to do those little scrawly lines, but it provides you no information. In terms of figuring out where the stops truly are along the way or when the next bus is going to come, this is also hard to find. It's really intimidating. When I get on, do I have to have exact change? If I do I have exact change? There's a lot of things that are confusing. So doing education outreach and TDM is really helpful. Having fare-free days. I mean, this is something Kansas City is now doing. They had fare-free streetcar that had the best ridership of any streetcar in the country, but it was paying for itself because the operations were paid for by increased taxes based on increased property values along it. So basically the property owners who benefited from this new amenity paid for the operations, and they did fine without any money coming in the fare box. That's one way you can do it. You could give out free passes. There's an example of a city in Oregon, I believe, that when people move in, they get a free transit pass. This is someone who hasn't set up their new system yet. They don't know how they're going to get around. Well, now they've got something worth trying. The other thing is just allowing people to interact with a bus when you don't have a line of people standing behind you. How do I pay this fare? What is it like? What do I do? How do I figure out what's going on? Let them board the bus and try it out. The BART system in San Francisco has what they call transit Sherpas, people who will go ride transit with people for an hour or two and just show them how to use it so that it's not so scary when they go to use it themselves. Even I think about my best friend growing up in New Orleans back before we had maps in our phones. She would not take a new route by herself ever because she was afraid she'd get lost. So if she didn't have someone in the car that knew the right way to go, she would only take the routes she knew. This is normal behavior, and for some reason, we don't expect normal behavior to exist. And we don't recognize how we can break down those barriers. And then we wonder why people don't try what can be potentially really scary things. And I'll just add one more personal anecdote. I wanted to take a bus from my high school, which is, if anyone's been to New Orleans, it's this courthouse-looking building on the river bend between St. Charles and Carrollton, and it's actually moved since then. But I wanted to just take it down Carrollton to my uncle's house. And I got on the bus, and I'm like, how hard can this be? It's a straight shot. And the bus turned at some point and started heading into an area I knew to be not very good, and the sun's going down. And my only option now is to jump off the bus in a neighborhood I don't know, try to figure out where the bus stop, and hope another bus comes soon. That's scary. And that's what our bus system is like for most people, because our bus system is set up in a way that's useful for the people who supply the bus service. It's to keep their prices down, not to make it friendly or usable to the customer. And we need to put a little bit more time and attention through outreach, information, and TDM to familiarize people with these modes if we want them to take it.
It's not if you build it, they will come. It's if you build it, make it easy,
Right.
and put it in the right
friendly.
place. And
Yeah.
any more questions? These have been incredible so far. Go. Right here.
So there was a lot of talk this morning, I know before you got here, about EVs and ride hailing. I'm just going to talk. And I just wanted your thoughts on that and the limitations, if that is sort of a future panacea.
Sure. So when I was at USDOT, we adopted 2 rounds of new cafe standards. When I was on Capitol Hill, we passed the first. My boss was really involved in passing the first cafe increase in 30 plus years. It's something I'm very committed to, and very excited to see people talking about EVs. There are a lot of barriers to it that are hard to overcome legislatively. It actually requires the industry to engage in a conversation seriously as if they actually want to sell these things, which I don't see a lot of evidence of. In my neighborhood, which is a neighborhood where people spend, it's a neighborhood full of people who are doing okay economically these days. Like I said, gentrification is rampant in my neighborhood, which is a shame because I didn't move in there to be around wealthy people. I moved there because I like the diversity and it's going away. But we don't have range anxiety. We don't have funding restrictions. We all generally want smaller vehicles because you can't park anything else. And you don't see many EVs in our neighborhood. We all have dedicated parking spaces. But if you go to a dealer, they don't want you to buy an EV because they know they will not have as much repairs to do on it. So they really strongly steer you away from them. And no one can answer how to build a charging station in my back that my neighbors can't plug into. That's what's holding it up. Is that not the stupidest thing you've ever heard? How hard would it be to fix that? And I worked at USDOT and I talked to the heads of these companies and they still haven't fixed it. So I don't have the greatest faith that this industry is really ready for prime time. I hope that changes, and I hope that the pressure from political leaders will push them in a better direction and that incentives will help. But even that isn't enough. There's really no area that reaches its climate goals just by converting the fleet to EVs. That they really do need to make it possible for people to drive shorter distances, which means they have to put the things they need closer to them and allow them to get out of their vehicle. And so this really needs to be a part of the conversation, and particularly state DOTs are at the middle of this. They are the emperors of this program, and if they are not actively engaged in this and a big player in moving the needle, which you'll know if they're measuring greenhouse gas emissions from their system, and if they're not players. That's going to be the question. So that's the first thing I'd ask. Is that being measured? Is that something they look at with at the system level, at the project level, that sort of thing? I will also say, from the benefits of other issues, an electric vehicle can kill someone just as well as an internal combustion engine vehicle. So you don't get any of the other benefits just by replacing one vehicle by another. We really need to think about allowing people to move around outside of a vehicle too. The other thing I will say on AVs is what I said earlier, that it's the policy that surrounds AVs that make them work or not work. I see no reason why they will be fleet vehicles right now. All of our ride-hailing companies are living at the, as long as the tolerance from their investors hold out. Right now, Uber is losing, what was it? Who saw it? It's like $5 billion a quarter, $2 billion a quarter? I don't know, it's in the B's, it's in the billions per quarter. At some point, the investors don't stay excited about that. AVs might make it cheaper to run a fleet, but it's not clear to me that reduces congestion. Ride-hailing has increased congestion. AVs make it cheaper to run empty vehicles. That could increase congestion. People only get out of their cars in neighborhoods where they could already get out of their cars. Ride-hailing is mostly picking up people who used to ride transit right now. It's not people displacing their car trip for the most part. It's people displacing other kinds of trips. So I think we have to think about the overall policy. And if we've made getting out of your car difficult, these new technologies will just be incorporated into the transportation system we know now. We could tax people for operating AVs empty or for having empty ride hails. They're filling up our corridors with empty vehicles. That's probably not good for us that are trying to get someplace. I see a future full of where I'm in the middle of traffic and there are no people in the cars around me. That's a possibility. It's the policy that changes that. It is not the responsibility of the technology to change that. And what worries me is the number of political officials who think that the new technology will get them out of the hard decisions that are necessary. If you see a public official asking the question of what policy do we need in place to make the AVs help us get where we want to go, that's the person to latch on to.
Well, I think that's all we're going to do for questions. Beth, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
I don't
for
know if
having
you
me.
guys all found that as engaging as I did. I am a bit of an optimist, so I sort of walked in here thinking that I would hit the answer to how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled. But at the very least, I think we have learned some new things and given everybody here food for thought and things to take back to your various hometowns. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next up, we got a 15-minute break followed by the next general session, Data in the Autonomous and Connected World. Following that, please go downstairs to the vendor hall where you can have an opportunity to take a look at everything. Thank you.